Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Fall. Lawrence Farley had built his empire from nothing. At 42, he commanded a construction empire worth over $100 million, with projects spanning 3 states. His calloused hands bore witness to the early days when he'd worked alongside his crews, but his sharp mind had elevated him far beyond manual labor. Lawrence was a man who remembered every favor, every slight, and every detail that mattered. His wife Charlotte had been by his side for 15 years. She was stunning at 38, with auburn hair and emerald eyes that had captivated him since their college days. They'd built their life together in the sprawling estate overlooking the valley where Lawrence's first major project had broken ground. Their daughter Kelly, now 14, was the light of his life, brilliant, ambitious, and carrying his determination in her young eyes. Blake Farley, Lawrence's younger brother by 3 years, had always lived in his shadow. While Lawrence built his empire, Blake had drifted through various ventures, always needing bailouts, always promising this time would be different. Lawrence had given him a position in the company out of loyalty, managing smaller residential projects. Blake harbored resentment that festered like an infected wound, hidden beneath grateful smiles and family dinners. The accident happened on a rain-slicked mountain road. Lawrence had been driving back from inspecting a remote construction site when a logging truck ran a red light. The collision was devastating. His custom Range Rover crumpled like paper, and Lawrence's head struck the reinforced door frame with crushing force. The paramedics later said it was a miracle he survived at all. Charlotte stood by his bedside in those first critical days, tears streaming down her face as machines kept him breathing. Kelly held his hand, whispering about school and her dreams of following in his footsteps. Blake visited daily, bringing flowers and speaking in hushed, concerned tones about keeping the business running in Lawrence's absence. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks became months, the vigil grew sporadic. Charlotte's tears dried up, replaced by phone calls taken in the hallway. Blake's visits became meetings with lawyers and accountants. Only Kelly remained constant, reading to her unconscious father and maintaining hope when others had begun to lose it. The medical team, led by Dr. James Burnett, was pessimistic. 6 months in a coma with no signs of consciousness was rarely overcome. The brain trauma was extensive, and while Lawrence's body remained stable, his mind seemed lost in darkness. Charlotte began speaking with increasing frequency about difficult decisions and what Lawrence would want. Chapter 2. The Awakening. Maddie Daniels had been Lawrence's night nurse for the past 2 months. A kind woman in her 50s, she'd seen families torn apart by tragedy before. She noticed how Charlotte's visits had dwindled to twice a week, always accompanied by Blake. She noticed how they spoke in the hallway rather than to Lawrence. Most importantly, she noticed the stack of get-well cards that had never been read aloud. On that fateful Tuesday night, Maddie decided to read some cards to Lawrence. She'd heard about coma patients responding to familiar voices and personal messages. The first few were from business associates, polite, professional well wishes. Then she found one from Blake, tucked beneath the others. The handwriting was hasty, as if written in passion rather than sympathy. "Lawrence," Maddie read softly, "I hope you never wake up. She's mine now, and so is your daughter and your $100 million company. Charlotte never loved you. She just loved what you could provide. But I can provide it now, and I'm giving her what you never could. By the time you hear this, if you ever do, it'll be too late. Everything you built, everything you loved, belongs to me." Maddie gasped, the cards slipping from her trembling fingers. She looked at Lawrence's still form, wondering if she should report this to someone, but unsure who to trust. The implications were staggering. Blake was having an affair with Charlotte, and they were positioning themselves to inherit Lawrence's empire. But Lawrence had heard every word. Deep in the darkness that had held him for 6 months, rage burned like a furnace. The betrayal was complete. His wife, his brother, his life's work, even his daughter being claimed by the man he'd trusted most. His consciousness clawed its way back through the fog of trauma, driven by pure fury. When his eyes opened, Maddie was disposing of the card, her face pale with shock. Lawrence's voice was barely a whisper, but his words were clear. "Don't tell anyone. I'm awake." Maddie spun around, her hand flying to her mouth. Lawrence's eyes were alert, burning with an intensity that made her step back. "Mr. Farley, I should call the doctor." "No," His voice was stronger now, months of vocal rest making speech painful but possible. How long? 6 months, Maddie whispered, understanding instinctively that this moment was dangerous. Your wife and brother, they've been managing everything. Lawrence's jaw clenched. Kelly. She visits every day after school. She never stopped believing you'd wake up. Maddie's voice was gentle, seeing the pain flash across his features. I need time. Don't tell anyone. Promise me. Maddie looked into his eyes and saw something that made her blood run cold. This wasn't the relief of awakening. This was the birth of something terrible. But she nodded. I promise. Lawrence closed his eyes, not returning to unconsciousness, but beginning to plan. 6 months. They thought they had won. They thought he was gone. His brother wanted everything he'd built, and his wife had willingly given it to him. But Lawrence Farley wasn't dead, and he never forgot a betrayal. Chapter 3. The Careful Observer. For 3 weeks, Lawrence maintained his charade. He'd learned to control his breathing, to keep his body perfectly still when visitors arrived. Maddie became his unwitting accomplice, coaching him on the subtle signs she'd watch for during her assessments. She was torn between medical ethics and the growing certainty that this man deserved to know the full scope of his betrayal before revealing himself. During visiting hours, Lawrence listened. Charlotte's voice had changed. There was a lightness to it that hadn't existed before, punctuated by hushed conversations with Blake about when this is all over. They spoke of selling the estate, of liquidating certain assets, of Kelly's future with casual ownership that made Lawrence's blood boil. The lawyers think another month, Charlotte had whispered to Blake during one visit. Dr. Burnett says the chances of recovery are essentially zero now. We can start the process. What about Kelly? Blake had asked. She'll understand eventually. Children are resilient, and she'll have everything she needs. Plus, I'll be happier, which is better for her too. Lawrence had wanted to strangle them both with his bare hands. But it was Kelly's visits that kept him sane. His daughter spoke to him about school, about her plans for their construction company, about the house she wanted to build someday. Her voice carried no guile, no hidden agenda, just pure love and hope. She was the only innocent party in this betrayal, and Lawrence swore she would be protected. Through Maddie, Lawrence began gathering intelligence. The nurse proved surprisingly resourceful, using her position to overhear conversations and observe behaviors. Charlotte and Blake had been careful, but 6 months of assumed security had made them careless. They're planning to get married, Maddie reported quietly during a night shift. I heard them talking about a ceremony next spring, after everything is settled. Business? Lawrence asked, his voice barely audible. Blake's been signing contracts in your name. Forged signatures. The board thinks you gave him power of attorney before the accident. There's talk of a major deal with some investors from Chicago, something about expanding into casino construction. Lawrence's eyes narrowed. Blake had always been impulsive, seeing quick money where Lawrence saw long-term disaster. Casino work meant dealing with people who didn't accept failure or betrayal kindly. It was a dangerous game his brother was playing with money and connections that weren't his to risk. The Chicago people are coming next week, Maddie continued. There's going to be a signing ceremony at your house. Charlotte's been planning it like a celebration. Perfect. Lawrence's mind was already working, cataloging resources, allies, and opportunities. He'd built his empire by being 3 steps ahead of his competition, and betrayers were just another form of opponent. Blake and Charlotte thought they were inheriting his life, but they had no idea what they'd actually awakened. Maddie, Lawrence whispered, I need you to make a phone call. The nurse hesitated. To whom? Wesley Molina. He's in my personal phone under insurance. Tell him Lawrence has a job for him, and he should wait for further instructions. Don't mention I'm awake. Just say you're calling on behalf of the family. Maddie nodded, though she didn't understand. Wesley Molina wasn't an insurance agent. He was Lawrence's private investigator, a former police detective who handled sensitive matters requiring discretion and creative solutions. If Lawrence was calling in Wesley, someone's world was about to come crashing down. As Maddie left to make the call, Lawrence stared at the ceiling and smiled for the first time in 6 months. Blake wanted his empire? Charlotte wanted his money? They were welcome to try taking it. But Lawrence Farley had built his fortune by being ruthless when necessary, and betrayal was the one sin he never forgave. The game was about to begin. Chapter 4. Setting the Board. Wesley Molina arrived at the hospital 2 days later, ostensibly visiting his old friend who lay in a coma. The stocky, graying man with sharp eyes had worked with Lawrence for over a decade, handling everything from employee background checks to competitive intelligence. When Maddie delivered the cryptic message, Wesley knew something significant was happening. Alone in the room with Lawrence, Wesley's poker face cracked when his supposedly comatose friend opened his eyes and placed a finger to his lips. "Jesus Christ, Lawrence," Wesley breathed. "How long?" "3 weeks since I woke up. 6 months since I died." Lawrence's voice was stronger now, physical therapy conducted in secret during night shifts with Maddie's help. "I need everything you can get me on Blake and Charlotte. Financial records, phone records, meeting schedules, who they're sleeping with, and what they had for breakfast. I want their entire lives mapped out." Wesley nodded grimly. "Already started when I got Maddie's call. Something felt off about Blake signing your contracts. You want to know what I've found so far? Tell me." "Blake's been living in your guest house for 3 months. Charlotte moved him in a week after the doctors said you might not wake up. Kelly doesn't know about the relationship. They're careful around her. But the staff has noticed. Your housekeeper, Sue Sims, quit rather than watch it happen." Lawrence filed that information away. Sue had worked for them for 5 years. Her loyalty was noted. "Financially, Blake's been careful but not perfect. He's been using your corporate accounts for personal expenses. Nothing huge, but it's adding up. The big problem is this Chicago deal. He's committed your company to a $50 million casino project with some very connected people. If that deal goes south, they'll come looking for their money from me," Lawrence finished. "Except I never authorized it." "Exactly. These aren't people who accept misunderstandings as excuses." Lawrence smiled coldly. "Perfect. What else?" "Charlotte's been talking to a divorce attorney. Confidential conversations. But my contact in that firm says she's exploring options for dissolving the marriage due to your condition. She wants everything. Custody of Kelly, the house, half the business assets. Over my dead body." "That might be the plan, Lawrence. I found something else. Charlotte's been meeting with Dr. Burnett privately. Not normal consultations. They've been discussing something called compassionate end-of-life decisions." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lawrence's eyes became chips of ice. "She's going to pull the plug. The paperwork's already drawn up. Blake's been pushing for it, saying it's what you would want. Dr. Burnett's been resistant, but Charlotte's wearing him down with emotional manipulation." Lawrence was quiet for a long moment, processing the full scope of their betrayal. They weren't just stealing his life. They were planning to end it entirely. Blake got the company, Charlotte got the insurance and inheritance, and they got each other. It was actually brilliant, in a psychopathic way. "When's the Chicago meeting?" Lawrence asked. 3 days. At your house. Blake's presenting himself as your authorized representative, and he's bringing signed contracts. After that meeting, the money transfers, and you're committed whether you're awake or not." "And the end-of-life discussion?" Wesley's face darkened. "Tomorrow, Charlotte scheduled a family meeting with Dr. Burnett to discuss options. She's bringing Blake for moral support." Lawrence nodded slowly. "Here's what we're going to do. Contact Alan Newton. He's been my attorney for 10 years. Tell him I need to see him urgently, but it has to be completely confidential. I also need you to reach out to Dominic Hunt." Wesley raised an eyebrow. Dominic Hunt was a federal prosecutor who owed Lawrence several favors from construction projects that had helped revitalize downtown areas. "You're thinking RICO? Fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. Let the lawyers figure out the charges. But first, I want them to hang themselves completely. No room for sympathy, no chance for plea deals." "What about Kelly?" Lawrence's expression softened slightly. "She's the only innocent in this. Whatever happens, she's protected. Blake and Charlotte made their choice when they decided to steal her father's life." Wesley stood to leave, then paused. "Lawrence, these Chicago people, they're not going to just write off $50 million if this deal collapses. They'll want someone to pay." "I know," Lawrence replied, his smile returning with predatory anticipation. "Blake's about to learn that actions have consequences. And Charlotte's going to discover that the man she thought she buried is very much alive and very much angry." As Wesley left, Lawrence closed his eyes and continued planning. Tomorrow, his beloved wife would try to convince a doctor to kill him. In 3 days, his brother would commit fraud with organized crime money using his name. They thought they were so clever, so careful in their betrayal. They had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been 20 years in the making. Chapter 5. The Tightening Noose. The family meeting convened in Dr. Burnett's office at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. Charlotte wore a black dress and carried tissues, the picture of a grieving wife facing an impossible decision. Blake stood beside her in a somber suit, his hand occasionally touching her shoulder in what appeared to be brotherly comfort. 3 floors above, Lawrence watched through the security camera system Wesley had tapped into. The investigator sat beside the hospital bed with a laptop, providing real-time commentary as the drama unfolded below. Charlotte's doing her grieving widow routine, Wesley murmured. Blake's playing the concerned brother perfectly. If I didn't know better, I'd believe them myself. Dr. Burnett appeared uncomfortable as Charlotte dabbed her eyes and spoke about Lawrence's quality of life and what he would have wanted. Blake added calculated comments about financial strain and the impossibility of hoping for a miracle after 6 months. Doctor, Charlotte said, her voice breaking at precisely the right moment. I can't keep watching him waste away like this. Lawrence was such a vital, powerful man. He would hate being trapped in that bed, dependent on machines. Mrs. Farley, I understand this is difficult, but there's still a possibility. After 6 months? Blake interrupted. Doctor, you said yourself the chances are less than 1%. We're not helping him by prolonging this. Lawrence watched his brother lean forward earnestly. Charlotte's been destroyed by this. She sits by his bed every day, hoping for something that's never going to happen. And Kelly, she needs her mother to be strong, to make the hard decisions. Dr. Burnett glanced between them. These decisions can't be made lightly. Mr. Farley is stable. His brain activity shows some response to stimuli. Reflexes, Charlotte said firmly. You explained that. Just reflexes, not consciousness. On the screen, Lawrence watched Dr. Burnett's resolve wavering. The doctor was a good man, but he was being manipulated by experts in emotional warfare. I need time to review his case files again, Dr. Burnett said finally. These decisions require careful consideration and consultation with the ethics board. Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell Lawrence recognized from years of poker games. His brother was frustrated by the delay. Of course, Doctor, Charlotte said graciously. We just want to do what's right for Lawrence. As they left the office, Wesley adjusted the camera angle to follow them down the hallway. Blake and Charlotte walked separately until they reached the parking garage, where Blake grabbed Charlotte's arm and pulled her behind a concrete pillar. This is taking too long, Blake hissed, unaware that Wesley had planted listening devices throughout the garage. The Chicago meeting is tomorrow, and I need this resolved before they start asking questions about Lawrence's condition. I'm handling it, Charlotte snapped. Burnett's weakening. Give me another week. We don't have another week. These people are flying in from Chicago expecting to meet with Lawrence personally. If they find out he's been in a coma for 6 months while I've been signing contracts in his name, then maybe you shouldn't have promised them a personal meeting. Blake's face darkened. Don't blame me for cleaning up the mess you created. You were supposed to handle the medical side months ago. I tried. But Kelly's always there, and the nurses talk. If I push too hard, people will ask questions. Lawrence watched his wife and brother tear into each other with cold satisfaction. Stress was breaking down their careful facade, revealing the calculating predators beneath. What about the insurance? Blake asked. $20 million, but only if it's ruled accidental death or natural causes. If there's any suspicion, then we stick to the original plan. Compassionate end-of-life care. You sign the papers, I handle the Chicago situation, and we're free and clear. Charlotte nodded, then moved closer to Blake. I just want this to be over. I want us to be together without hiding. They kissed passionately against the concrete pillar, unaware that every word and gesture was being recorded in high definition. Charming couple, Wesley muttered, closing the laptop. I've got enough evidence here to bury them both. But you said you wanted them to hang themselves completely. I do, Lawrence replied. Tomorrow's meeting with the Chicago people will be the final nail. Blake's going to commit fraud with organized crime money, and Charlotte's going to provide him with the perfect alibi by having me declared brain dead. What about Kelly? Lawrence's expression softened. Tonight, after she visits, I'm going to reveal myself to her. She deserves to know the truth, and she's going to need protection when this all comes crashing down. Wesley packed up his equipment. The Chicago people are staying at the Grand Hotel downtown. My contact says they're not the type to forgive and forget if this deal goes sideways. Perfect. Blake wants to play with fire. Let him get burned. But first, I want to watch him commit himself completely. No backing out. No claim that he was just trying to keep the business running. Tomorrow, he's going to sign contracts that will destroy him. As Wesley left, Lawrence settled back into his hospital bed to wait for his daughter's visit. Soon, Kelly would learn that her father was alive and that the people she trusted most had betrayed them both. But she would also learn that Lawrence Farley never forgave a betrayal, and retribution was coming like a storm. The trap was set. Tomorrow, Blake and Charlotte would walk into it willingly, and their perfect crime would become their perfect downfall. Chapter 6. The Point of No Return. Kelly's visit that evening broke Lawrence's heart and strengthened his resolve simultaneously. His 14-year-old daughter sat beside his bed, reading aloud from her biology textbook and chattering about her plans for winter break. She spoke of Charlotte's increasing absences and Blake's attempts to help with things around the house, but her innocent perspective missed the sinister implications. "Mom's been really sad lately," Kelly said, unconsciously echoing the very manipulation Charlotte had used on Dr. Burnett. "Uncle Blake says she needs space to process everything, but I think she just misses you too much." When visiting hours ended and the hallway grew quiet, Lawrence gently touched his daughter's hand. "Kelly," she gasped, nearly falling from her chair as her father's eyes opened and focused on her face. "Dad? Oh my God, Dad." Tears streamed down her face as she reached for the call button. "No," Lawrence said softly but firmly. "Not yet. We need to talk first." For the next hour, Lawrence carefully explained what he'd discovered, watching his daughter's face transform from joy to confusion to heartbreak and finally to cold anger that reminded him exactly whose daughter she was. "They want to kill you," Kelly whispered, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. "They want to steal everything we've built together. The company, the house, our family, everything." Kelly's tears had stopped, replaced by the same calculating intelligence that had made Lawrence successful. "What do? We let them think they've won, right up until the moment they lose everything. But you have to be strong, and you have to trust me completely. Can you do that?" His daughter nodded without hesitation. "What do you need me to do?" Lawrence smiled proudly. Kelly was definitely his child. The next morning brought the Chicago delegation to Lawrence's estate. Blake had orchestrated the meeting perfectly, transforming the grand dining room into a conference space worthy of a $50 million deal. Charlotte played hostess with elegant efficiency, ensuring everyone understood that she and Blake were Lawrence's authorized representatives during his extended medical leave. Wesley monitored everything from a surveillance van parked near the estate's service entrance. Through carefully placed cameras and listening devices, Lawrence watched his brother commit the ultimate betrayal from his hospital bed. The Chicago delegation consisted of 3 men: Robert Bush, the primary investor, Andrew Castillo, their attorney, and Frederick McKinney, whose role was never explicitly stated but whose presence made everyone slightly nervous. They were expensively dressed, impeccably polite, and radiated the kind of quiet menace that came from having options when civility failed. "Mr. Farley's reputation in construction is legendary," Robert Bush said, accepting champagne from Charlotte. "We're honored to be working with your organization." Blake preened under the praise, signing documents with Lawrence's forged signature while Charlotte provided witness signatures. The contracts committed Lawrence's company to building 3 casino complexes, with severe financial penalties for failure to complete on schedule. "My brother always said that a man's word is his bond," Blake declared, unaware that Frederick McKinney was studying him with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Indeed," McKinney replied quietly. "We take commitments very seriously. Our previous contractor failed to deliver on his promises. He's no longer in business." The casual menace in McKinney's voice made Charlotte visibly nervous, but Blake was too intoxicated by the moment to notice. As the contracts were finalized, Wesley's voice crackled through Lawrence's earpiece. "They're transferring $10 million as a good faith payment. Blake just committed felony fraud with organized crime money." Lawrence smiled grimly. His brother had always been greedy and impulsive, but this exceeded even his worst expectations. After the Chicago delegation departed, Blake and Charlotte celebrated in Lawrence's home office, drinking his vintage scotch and planning their future with his money. 24 hours, Blake said, loosening his tie. "Burnett will sign the end-of-life order tomorrow, and this nightmare will finally be over. What if Lawrence wakes up? Charlotte asked, a trace of genuine fear in her voice. Blake laughed harshly. After 6 months? Even if he did, the brain damage would be severe. He'd never be able to challenge anything we've done. And if he remembers anything? Charlotte, stop worrying. He's gone. We won. In a week, you'll be a widow with a $20 million insurance settlement, and I'll be running a $100 million construction empire. Kelly will inherit everything eventually, but we'll be her guardians until she's 18. Charlotte moved closer to Blake, her voice dropping to a seductive whisper. And then we can be together openly. Forever, Blake promised, kissing her deeply in Lawrence's own office. Lawrence ended the surveillance feed, having seen enough. Tomorrow, Dr. Burnett would sign papers authorizing the termination of life support. Tomorrow evening, Charlotte would become a widow. By tomorrow night, Blake would be celebrating his victory. They had no idea that tomorrow would also bring federal agents, criminal charges, and the full fury of a man who never forgot a betrayal. Lawrence picked up the secure phone Wesley had provided and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago. Dominic? It's Lawrence Farley. Yes, I know everyone thinks I'm in a coma. We need to talk. Chapter 7, The Resurrection. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, Lawrence Farley opened his eyes in front of Dr. Burnett in a hospital full of witnesses. The timing was perfect. 30 minutes before Charlotte and Blake were scheduled to sign the papers ending his life support. The medical team's reaction was immediate and chaotic. Nurses rushed to check vital signs while Dr. Burnett stared in amazement at his miraculous patient. Within minutes, the hospital was buzzing with news of the impossible recovery. Charlotte received the call while applying makeup for what she believed would be Lawrence's final day. Her face went white as she listened to Dr. Burnett's excited explanation about brain function and consciousness levels. That's wonderful news, doctor, she stammered. I'll be right there. Blake was in Lawrence's office, transferring the Chicago money into accounts he controlled, when Charlotte burst in with the devastating news. He's awake, she said, her voice hollow with shock. Lawrence is awake and talking. The color drained from Blake's face. That's impossible. You said. I know what I said. But he's awake, and they're running tests, and... Charlotte sank into a chair, the magnitude of their situation hitting her. Blake, what if he remembers? What if he knows? Blake's mind raced through the implications. The forged signatures, the Chicago contracts, the money already transferred. All of it would be exposed the moment Lawrence reviewed the business accounts. We stick to the story, Blake said firmly. We were protecting his interests while he was incapacitated. Everything we did was for his benefit. The affair? Living in his house? Planning to kill him? He doesn't know about any of that. How could he? He was unconscious. But even as Blake spoke the words, doubt crept into his voice. Something felt wrong about the timing, about Lawrence waking up exactly when their plan was reaching completion. At the hospital, Lawrence was orchestrating his resurrection with theatrical precision. He played the role of confused recovery patient perfectly, asking about business matters with just the right amount of concern and confusion. How long was I out? He asked Dr. Burnett, though he knew the answer to the minute. 6 months, Mr. Farley. It's truly miraculous that you've recovered this level of cognitive function. 6 months. Lawrence's performance of shock was flawless. The business, my family. I need to see Charlotte and Blake. They're on their way, Dr. Burnett assured him. They've been managing everything in your absence. Your brother has been particularly dedicated to keeping your company running. Lawrence smiled weakly. Blake always was loyal. When Charlotte and Blake arrived an hour later, their reunion was captured by local news cameras that had gathered to cover the miraculous recovery story. Charlotte's tearful embrace and Blake's emotional gratitude played perfectly for the media, but Lawrence felt the tension in their bodies, the fear barely concealed behind their joy. I'm so sorry, Lawrence, Charlotte whispered in his ear as cameras clicked around them. I thought I'd lost you forever. You'll never lose me, Lawrence replied, holding her gaze with eyes that seemed to see straight through her soul. I'm not going anywhere. Blake stepped forward, grasping Lawrence's hand with both of his. Brother, I've missed you so much. I've been trying to keep everything together, but it's not the same without you. I'm sure you did your best, Lawrence said warmly. We'll have to go over everything together. I want to know about every decision, every contract, every detail of what happened while I was gone. The flash of panic in Blake's eyes was so brief that only Lawrence caught it. "Of course," Blake said. "But maybe you should rest first. Recovery takes time." "Nonsense. I feel fine, and I'm eager to get back to work. In fact, I'd like to review the books tonight. Can you have Wesley bring me the financial reports?" Blake's face went ashen. If Wesley was involved, their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. "Actually," a new voice interrupted, "that won't be necessary." Everyone turned to see Wesley Molina entering the hospital room, followed by two men in expensive suits who radiated federal authority. "Lawrence," Wesley said with a grin, "I'd like you to meet Special Agent Nicholas Hill and Prosecutor Dominic Hunt. They have some very interesting questions about business transactions that occurred while you were unconscious." Blake stepped backward involuntarily. "I don't understand. What's this about?" Agent Hill produced a badge and a warrant. "Blake Farley, you're under arrest for federal fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. Charlotte Farley, you're also under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud." The hospital room erupted in chaos as security guards restrained Blake and Charlotte while they screamed denials and accusations. News cameras captured every moment as the grieving family's facade collapsed into criminal reality. "Lawrence," Charlotte shouted as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "You don't understand. Everything we did was for you." Lawrence watched with cold satisfaction as his wife and brother were led away in chains. "I understand perfectly, Charlotte. I heard every word." As the commotion settled and the room cleared, Lawrence turned to Wesley and Dominic. "How long before they realize the full scope of what they've done?" "The Chicago people should be getting the news about now," Wesley replied. "They don't like being defrauded, and they really don't like having their money stolen." Dominic Hunt nodded grimly. "Blake and Charlotte are looking at 20 to life if convicted. But they might not live long enough to see trial if those casino investors decide to handle this themselves." Lawrence felt no sympathy. Blake and Charlotte had chosen their path when they decided to betray the man who trusted them most. Now they would face the consequences of their choices, and Lawrence would watch their destruction with the same cold calculation they'd shown while planning his death. The resurrection was complete. Now came the reckoning. Chapter 8. The Unraveling. The news of Lawrence Farley's miraculous recovery and the subsequent arrests dominated headlines for days. But behind the media circus, a much more dangerous drama was unfolding as the Chicago investors learned they'd been defrauded by a man who'd stolen their money while pretending to represent a comatose business partner. Robert Bush's phone call to Lawrence came that evening, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man accustomed to having problems disappear permanently. "Mr. Farley, we have a situation that requires immediate clarification." "I'm sure we do," Lawrence replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm still recovering from my condition, but I understand there may have been some unauthorized transactions." $10 million, Mr. Farley. Your brother took $10 million of our money for contracts that apparently never had your approval. I'm afraid Blake exceeded his authority. I never authorized any casino projects, and I certainly never authorized him to sign contracts in my name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Bush spoke again. "Mr. Farley, we are not people who accept misunderstandings as explanations for missing money. I understand completely. However, I was unconscious and therefore cannot be held responsible for my brother's criminal actions. I suggest you take this matter up with Blake directly. Blake is in federal custody. He's not exactly available for debt collection." Lawrence smiled coldly. "That does present a problem for you, doesn't it?" Another long pause. "Mr. Farley, are you refusing to honor contracts signed with your company's seal?" "I'm stating that those contracts are fraudulent and legally void. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you consult your attorney, Andrew Castillo." The threat in Bush's voice became unmistakable. "Mr. Farley, you may want to reconsider your position. We have significant resources for resolving disputes." "So do I," Lawrence replied calmly. "The difference is, mine are legal. This conversation is being recorded, Mr. Bush, and threatening federal witnesses tends to add additional charges to criminal enterprises. I'm sure Prosecutor Dominic Hunt would be interested in hearing your creative approaches to debt collection." The line went dead. Within hours, Wesley's surveillance network detected increased activity around Lawrence's estate and the hospital. The Chicago delegation had not returned home as expected, and Frederick McKinney had been seen meeting with local associates whose backgrounds suggested they specialized in permanent problem resolution. They're not going to just write off $10 million, Wesley warned during a secure briefing in Lawrence's hospital room. These people have reputations to maintain. Good, Lawrence replied, studying surveillance photos of McKinney's associates. I want them to make the attempt. Blake and Charlotte destroyed my family. I want their new friends to complete their destruction. Meanwhile, in separate federal holding facilities, Blake and Charlotte were discovering that their perfect crime had become a perfect nightmare. Blake's cellmate was a career criminal who took immediate interest in learning that Blake had defrauded casino investors. Chicago casino money, the man laughed harshly. Brother, you might as well have stolen from the devil himself. Those people don't forgive, they don't forget, and they sure as hell don't let people retire after screwing them. Charlotte's situation was equally grim. Her attorney, Alan Newton, who had also represented Lawrence for years, delivered the crushing news that her husband was not only alive, but fully aware of her betrayal. Charlotte, he has recordings of everything. Your conversations with Blake, your meetings with Dr. Burnett, your plans to end his life support. The federal prosecutor has enough evidence to seek the death penalty for conspiracy to commit murder. But I never actually. You planned to kill your husband for insurance money while conducting an affair with his brother. Intent is enough for capital charges. Charlotte's composure finally cracked completely. Lawrence can't do this to me. I'm the mother of his child. You forfeited any consideration when you chose to betray him, Newton replied coldly. Lawrence Farley is many things, but forgiving isn't one of them. As the days passed, the federal case against Blake and Charlotte strengthened while their situation with the Chicago investors deteriorated. McKinney's associates had attempted to approach Lawrence directly, only to discover that his hospital room was under federal protection and his estate was crawling with armed security. The breakthrough came when Blake, desperate to save himself, agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for witness protection. His testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, including details about Charlotte's relationship with Dr. Burnett and their systematic planning of Lawrence's murder. But Blake's cooperation came too late to save him from other consequences. Frederick McKinney had decades of experience in making problems disappear, and a man in federal custody was still within reach of someone with the right connections and sufficient motivation. The attack came during Blake's transport to a federal courthouse for a preliminary hearing. McKinney's associates struck with professional precision, but they hadn't anticipated Wesley's counter-surveillance or the protective detail Dominic Hunt had arranged. When the smoke cleared, Blake was wounded but alive. McKinney was in federal custody on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy, and the Chicago organization found itself facing a massive federal investigation that would ultimately destroy their entire operation. Lawrence watched the news coverage from his hospital bed with cold satisfaction. Blake and Charlotte had wanted to destroy his life. Instead, they had destroyed their own and brought down the criminal organization they'd tried to defraud. But the reckoning wasn't complete. Lawrence had one final lesson to teach about the consequences of betrayal. Chapter 9, No Forgiveness. 3 months later, Lawrence Farley walked out of the federal courthouse having testified at the trials that would send Blake and Charlotte to prison for the rest of their lives. Blake received 40 years for federal fraud and conspiracy. Charlotte got life without parole for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted insurance fraud. The Chicago organization had been dismantled by federal prosecutors, with Robert Bush and Frederick McKinney facing their own lengthy sentences. The $10 million had been recovered and returned to Lawrence's accounts, along with additional assets seized from the criminal enterprise. But for Lawrence, the legal victory was only the beginning of his revenge. Kelly, now 15 and hardened by the betrayal of people she'd trusted, stood beside her father as they visited Charlotte in federal prison. The reunion was heartbreaking in its coldness. "My baby," Charlotte sobbed, reaching through the plexiglass partition. "I'm so sorry. Everything I did was for us, for our future." Kelly stared at her mother with Lawrence's cold eyes. "You tried to murder my father. You don't get to apologize for that. Kelly, please. I'm still your mother." "No," Lawrence said firmly. "You forfeited that right when you chose Blake over your family. Kelly has legally changed her last name and elected to remain solely in my custody. You have no parental rights remaining." Charlotte's face crumpled as the full scope of her loss became clear. She had gained nothing and lost everything: her husband, her daughter, her freedom, and her future. "Lawrence, please," she whispered. "Don't let her hate me forever." "That's her choice to make," Lawrence replied. "But I'll never make it easy for her to forget what you did." The visit ended with Charlotte screaming apologies and pleas that fell on deaf ears as Lawrence and Kelly walked away without looking back. Blake's encounter was even more brutal. Lawrence visited his brother alone, finding him confined to a wheelchair after the assassination attempt that had left him partially paralyzed. "Lawrence," Blake said weakly, "I know what I did was wrong, but we're still brothers." "No," Lawrence replied with surgical precision. "We stopped being brothers when you decided to steal my life. You're nothing to me now except a cautionary tale about the consequences of betrayal. I'm sorry. I was jealous. I was stupid, but I never wanted to hurt you. You tried to steal my company, seduce my wife, corrupt my daughter, and murder me in a hospital bed. Your intentions are irrelevant. Your actions defined who you are." Blake began to cry, the full weight of his destruction finally hitting him. "What happens now? You serve your sentence and think about your choices. Every day for the next 40 years, you'll remember that you had everything a man could want: a loving brother, a successful business, a place in a family. And you threw it all away for money and a woman who never loved either of us." Lawrence stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Blake, the Chicago investors sent a message through their attorney. They want you to know that 40 years is a long time to serve, and they have friends everywhere. Sleep well." Blake's terrified expression was the last thing Lawrence saw as he walked away from his brother forever. Outside the prison, Kelly waited in the car, studying architectural plans for the new corporate headquarters they would build together. She had inherited her father's brilliance and his unforgiving nature. At 15, she was already showing signs of becoming a formidable business leader. "Did you tell him?" she asked as Lawrence got into the driver's seat. "I told him the truth. Actions have consequences, and betrayal is unforgivable." "Good." Kelly's voice carried no warmth for the uncle who had tried to steal her inheritance. "What about the business?" "Stronger than ever. Blake's fraud actually helped us. The federal investigation revealed several competitors' weaknesses, and the publicity from the case brought us new clients who admire our principles." Lawrence had indeed emerged stronger from the betrayal. The construction empire now valued at over $200 million, his personal reputation enhanced by his survival and the dramatic downfall of those who had betrayed him. But most importantly, he had Kelly, the one person who had remained loyal, who had shared his burden, and who would carry on his legacy of strength and uncompromising principles. As they drove away from the prison toward their future, Lawrence reflected on the complete destruction of his enemies. Blake would die in federal prison, probably at the hands of criminals connected to the Chicago organization. Charlotte would spend the rest of her life in a cell, knowing she had lost her daughter forever. The criminal enterprise that had threatened his family was destroyed. Lawrence Farley had built his empire on the principle that a man's word was his bond, and betrayal was unforgivable. Blake and Charlotte had tested that principle and paid the ultimate price. The reckoning was complete. Justice was served. And Lawrence Farley had proven once again that he never forgot a betrayal and never showed mercy to those who crossed him. In the end, he had lost a wife and a brother, but he had gained something more valuable: the absolute certainty that his principles were unshakable and that those who remained loyal would be protected while those who betrayed would be destroyed without mercy or forgiveness. The Lawrence Farley who emerged from this crucible was harder, colder, and more dangerous than ever. And anyone foolish enough to challenge him in the future would learn the same lesson that Blake and Charlotte had learned too late. Some men forgive. Some men forget. Lawrence Farley did neither.